Good evening. I'm Miss Hubble, and we're going to review Chapter 7, the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. Okay, so these are the goals of the chapter, basically describing the development of the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 and the purpose and the goals of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the structure of that. Also, No Child Left Behind, the major principles of No Child Left Behind, and the reauthorization pr- proposals for Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Okay, so the U.S. is a system of government, and it's a federal system, and so we have states under the single central government. So the federal government protects people's rights and liberties and shares authorities with the state, which is the 10th Amendment. Powers that are not granted to the government are granted to the states. So the laws of the 50 states govern education. Federal government's role in education, as we've talked about before, is really funding. 90% of the funding is provided by states and local districts. 10% is provided by the government. The Morrill Act of 1862 said Congress provided land grants to states used for colleges. Okay. Um, we have categorical grants, providing supplementary assistance to the state systems and shaping the educational policies. States can choose to accept the grants or reject them. If they accept them, it means that they agree to abide by the federal guidelines. And these are things that we've talked about before: the National Defense Education Act of 1958, Higher Education Facilities Act of 1963, Vocational Education Act of 1963, Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 65, and the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which is now the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. All of these are categorical grants that help the states. Um, so, historical developments, kind of thinking about A Nation at Risk, the National Commission for the Excellence in Education, placing education at the top of the nation's agenda, strengthening high school graduation requirements, thinking about measurable standards of academic performance, increased time devoted to learning, and also raising the standards for teachers, what we expect a teacher to know and be able to do. So President Bush's goals by the year 2000 were that every child must start to school ready to learn. The U.S. must have increased high school graduation rate to more than 90%, 90 or better. Critical subjects, 4th, 8th, and 12th performance are assessed. U.S. students would be the first in the world in math and science achievement. Every American adult would be skilled, literate worker. And every school would offer the kind of disciplined environment that made it possible for students to learn. Now we know that all of these are not exactly true, but it's good to have a goal. Um, but this was important because having this goal at this summit meant that some things were going to change in education. So we have the Improving America's Schools Act of 1994. The federal role continued to increase with the passage of the Improving America Schools Act of 94, which was a reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act. It focused on implementing standards-based education through the nation. It also created a framework in which the federal government not only provided aid to schools serving economically disadvantaged students, but also extended support to states implementing local and state standards-based reform. And it focused on states developing challenging academic standards, creating and aligning assessments for all students, holding schools accountable for results, and increasing aid to high poverty schools. NAEP is the nation's report card. Extensive data collection system that includes achievement tests in a number of areas, including reading and math. It also provides information about subject matter achievement, characteristics of student population, instruction, school environment, and population. Okay, so the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, it was President Bush's priority when he took office. The No Child Left Behind Act reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and also built the foundation of the um, ESSA by significantly changing the federal government's role in education. Required that all public schools bring every student up to state standards in reading and math within a certain time period, closing the achievement gap based on race, ethnicity, and language. We're still trying to do this today, but he put that focus out there. Required a major shift in the way that teachers, administrators, and the State Board of Ed thought about public schooling. It also put pressure on teachers to increase achievement of all students and to narrow the gap between student groups, like between students of poverty, students with disabilities, um, students that were in higher economic status, also among ethnicities. Teachers and administration needed to understand the scientifically based instructional strategies and be able to evaluate students' progress and make effective instructional decisions based on data. This was a new thing, and I know it doesn't seem like it, but things were not happening like that. And so it was really important to bring the research back into that and make sure that we're making research based decisions. Um, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, the ARA Act of 2009, was also known as the Stimulus Act, and it was signed by President Obama in 2009. It provided 10 billion extra funding dollars under the Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to assist districts with high concentration of poverty. So this provided extra money for schools in poverty, provided Title I improvement grants for achievement of students living in poverty. So the goals of this were to help students progress towards rigorous college and career standards, to establish pre-K to college career and data systems that tracked progress towards improvement, improve teacher effectiveness, provide intensive support and effective interventions for the lowest performing schools. So still the focus is on bridging the gap, the learning gap. Um, the Race to the Top was an initiative by President Obama to provide grants to the states. Four areas that he focused on were adopting standards and assessments that prepare students to succeed in college and the workplace and to compete in a global economy. Also, building data systems that measure student growth and success and inform teachers and principals about how we can improve instruction. Recruiting, developing, rewarding, and retaining effective teachers and principals, especially in high need areas. And also turn around those low achieving schools into high achieving schools. So then we have the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. So provisions of No Child Left Behind were retained. In other words, we kept those. We look at academic content, achievement standards, academic assessment of student reading and math, disaggregating testing data by school and subgroup, and funding. And also change ESSA provide a change in the level of federal government in education. States were given more latitude, so the states could become more involved again in setting academic goals, and the states are responsible for determining when and how to intervene in low performing schools. So, kind of going back to the way it was before, where states were more in control. The purpose of No Child Left Behind is was to establish statewide standards and assessments required school districts to be accountable for student learning by meeting standards of adequate yearly progress and applying rewards and sanctions, basing reading and math instruction on scientifically based research. This is huge because we had some time periods where it wasn't, and you can tell student people need to be taught in a research based method with materials that are proven effective. Ensuring teachers were highly qualified in the content areas, that's big too, because you want to make sure that the teachers have the credentials to teach that subject or special ed or whatever the area. Okay, goals of No Child Left Behind: all students would achieve important state identified academic learning standards. And like here in Texas, we have the STAR test. Um, at the time, we had TAX. All teachers would be highly qualified, meaning they would meet those highly qualified standards of being certified in the grade level or subject area that they're teaching. also in special education, ESL, GT, any of those areas. All students would be educated in schools that were safe, drug-free, and conducive to learning. And all students will graduate from high school. Okay, so the major principles are saying that um, requiring that states develop or adopt statewide academic standards and statewide assessments based on the standards, and that they also hold schools accountable for improving student performance through a goal based system called adequate yearly progress, a system of increasingly severe sanctions if goals were not met. Requires also that instruction in reading and math have a foundation, again, in the scientifically based research, requiring that public school students are taught by highly qualified teachers. So, thinking about this adequate yearly progress, we'll talk more about that at another time, but adequate yearly progress is where they're looking at the progress of the school and how many students, like looking at the subgroups versus the whole group of the students for that grade, and knowing if there's measuring if there's adequate progress there by their standards that they set. Okay, statewide standards. Each state, well, every state had to establish their own standards of what a student should know and be able to do. So we have achievement standards aligned with the content standards. So we have those here in Texas, and they're called TEKS. And then the test that the standards-based assessments that students take are based on the TEKS. There's also two levels of high achievement, proficient, and advanced, to provide the guidelines for schools, parents, and communities and tell them what achievement is expected. So basically, those standards are they're wanting the states to have those high standards, have statewide standards, and for achievement to be measured using standards based assessments. Okay, statewide assessments are supposed to measure how successfully students were learning what was expected and how they're progressing toward meeting the important standards. They must be reliable and valid, and school results compared with district results. Or school results will be compared with district and state, individual student reports, and public schools must test 95% of the students, including low income, students with disabilities, limited English, students from diverse racial and ethnic groups. So these state assessments, they're talking about the STAR test, or if you were in school a while ago, that might be the TAX test. Um, so that's what they're talking about. And this 95% is saying like we can't exempt kids because we can't say that some kids don't have to test. Almost every student will have to test. Okay, so students with disabilities are held to the standard for their enrolled grade, and in some cases with accommodations to get a true picture of their achievement. There are also students with disabilities that are eligible for special ed must take one of the following: regular assessments given to all students, regular assessment given to all students with state approved accommodations, or an alternate assessment. So basically, the choices are the regular test with accommodations, or an alternate assessment. And the alternate assessment would be an assessment that is based on their IEP and based on a student having a significant intellectual disability. So, adequate yearly progress is talking about accountability. States had to define what AYP was to determine if those districts were meeting the standards. AYP and students with disabilities. Statewide assessment results for students with disabilities are required to be reported both as a subgroup of only people with disabilities and then also as part of the whole student body. Students assessed using alternate assessments were also included in AYP. Federal government capped the number of students who passed the alternate assessment that can be counted. Cap was set at 1% of the total population. Okay, so what this is kind of a big deal because students with disabilities in special education, AYP is saying, hey, we acknowledge that they might take a different test, but only 1% of that total population can have a test that's alternate that will be counted. So more than that might take the test, but the scores from only that 1% will be counted. Also, that the students with disabilities, their results will be included in a subgroup of students with disabilities, but also as part of the whole student body because they are part of the whole student body. So thinking about this sanctions for not meeting AYP. So if a school did not achieve adequate yearly progress for 2 years in a row, then they were identified as needing improvement. The state provided technical assistance to help the school address specific issues. Um, the school, with parents and outside experts, developed a 2-year implementation plan, and schools were required to offer parents in the school the option to go to another school within the district. And so they would hold a public meeting at the school where they would explain and provide parents with information and then let them know that they would have the option to send their student to another school within the district that is rated higher. If the school fails to meet AYP for the third consecutive year, then the district provides technical assistance and parents get school choice. Um, Schools must offer the parents supplemental education, such as tutoring, like brain balance, or I can't think what it's called, Sylvan, things like that. Okay, for students with disabilities, supplemental services must include specific achievable goals, description of how the progress will be measured, and a timetable for improvement. And then the scientifically based instruction, No Child Left Behind does require that in all aspects. And the goal is to rely on science when making decisions about the most effective way to improve achievement. According to Rod Page, the intent of No Child Left Behind was to apply rigorous educational research, and the research based instruction is used in classroom instruction. Scientifically based research involved the application of rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures to obtain reliable and valid knowledge relevant to educational activities and programs. So that also means that we're using research that is systematic, empirical methods that draw on observations, involve rigorous data analyses, and are adequate to state hypotheses and draw conclusions, and that they provide valid data, and they're peer reviewed by a panel of experts. So, highly qualified teachers. Each state had to develop a plan to ensure that all the state's public school teachers were highly qualified to teach the core academic subjects. So, they would have a minimum of a bachelor's degree from a college or a university. Teachers must have had a full certification or licensure for the area that they taught. Teachers are required to demonstrate subject matter competency in the core academic subjects that they taught. And they could demonstrate this by passing a state administered test in each core subject that they teach, structure and content of the test to be determined by the state. Um, the Individuals with Disabilities Act of the revision of 2004 required that special ed teachers had to meet the same highly qualified standard as general educators did. So they must have a bachelor's degree, full certification as a special ed teacher, or pass the special ed teacher licensing exam and held a license as a special ed teacher. Even those that are in approved alternate certification programs pass a state administered test of subject and teaching skill. So it could be the elementary competency and basic elementary curriculum. Secondary would be the core academic would be highly qualified in every core that they teach. It applies whether the teacher is in the regular class, resource, or another setting. Okay, so reading first, teaching young children to read is the most critical educational priority. Definitely. This is the U.S. Department of Ed in 2002. So, three unique aspects of reading first are that it focuses on reading instruction that was supported by scientifically based research, provides a large amount of money to states could receive to provide training to teachers and to implement professional development activities. It also emphasized early identification of children at risk for reading failure so effective instruction could be provided. So the goal is all children in the U.S. will learn to read well by the end of the third grade. And the reading first, it really did help us focus on the three-tiered instruction and research-based and using the data that we have from those early reading assessments. The purpose of the elementary and secondary, I'm sorry, the Every Child Every Student Succeeds Act is that they ensure that the students in public schools achieve important learning goals while being educated in safe classrooms, and required schools to close academic gaps between economically advantaged students and students from different economic, racial, and ethnic backgrounds, as well as those with disabilities. Also, eliminated AYP, but states had to create their own accountability systems and that have long-term goals for all students. The goals were here: essential protection for underprivileged and high need students. All students must be educated towards high educational standards, with college and career goals, and that information needs to be provided to the educators, families, and students about yearly statewide assessments and students' progress towards the academic goals, and supporting and cultivating local innovations, including evidence based interventions, and um, supporting and increasing investments in highly qualified preschool, and upholding expectations for accountability, and allowing states to administer corrective action to cultivate change in low performing schools. And so these are the major standards, statewide assessments, evidence based intervention, highly qualified, and additional provisions. So the statewide standards, these are the standards that we had: basic, proficient, and advanced. They must look at language arts, reading, and science. Much of the No Child Left Behind are still in effect. Statewide assessment must be accessible to all students, including ELL students and students with disabilities. And statewide assessments can be administered via a computer. Okay, accommodations, as long as they don't invalidate the test and they're consistent with state guidelines for the use of accommodations, students with special ed or 504 accommodations can be provided those on state assessments. Alternate assessments they are aligned to the content standards, encouraged to access to the general ed curriculum. They're based on the student's IEP, and they're consistent with professional conclusions regarding standards achievable by the student, and they're aligned with post-secondary or employment. So they might be a drill down version of that grade level take. So then states still must have academic achievement standards with 3 levels of achievement, long-term goals, including measures to assess interim progress towards the goals, and indicators to measure that all public school students and subgroups um, are performing on the statewide assessments, which shows proficiency, graduation rates, growth, and other academic metrics. And also that ELL students and high schools ELL students are being more proficient, and high schools can also administer SAT or ACT instead of a statewide assessment. Okay, so the comprehension for the accountability is identification and remediation of low performing schools. States have a method of identifying that, and they must target them for support. They must help them. Comprehensive support and improvement plans, which is similar to the identified for improvement. Targeted support and improvement each year. Each year, states identify schools in which the students have consistently underperformed, evidence-based interventions, approval and monitoring, and results in additional action if the unsuccessful plan has been enacted. Um, as far as interventions, we want to look at evidence-based interventions. They must be evidence-based if the intervention shows statistically significant effects on improving student outcomes. And it must have 3 tiers of evidence: strong evidence from at least one well-designed experimental study, moderate evidence from at least one well-designed experimental study, promising evidence from at least one well-designed experimental study. If none is available, a 4th tier is if the rationale is based on high quality research or a positive evaluation that the intervention is likely to improve outcomes. Okay, so additional provisions: states are required to develop plans to address how they will reduce bullying, harassment, restraint, seclusion, suspension, and expulsion. Um, and we'll also create a comprehension center on intervening with students who are not attaining full literacy. The center will promote best practices in screening, assessing, and intervening with students. Um, and the Jacob Javits Law which funds research for gifted education, is refunded, and states will um, be required to use teacher developed funding to support education of the gifted and talented. And it also eliminates ESSA, eliminates the reading first, and create a more poorly funded program in literacy development that leaves decision making on using the funds to local officials. Okay, so these are the additional things. Local education agencies, school districts are encouraged to use funds to support developing evidence-based multi-tiered systems of support and behavioral interventions. They also created a comprehensive grant that could attract, retain, and reward science, technology, engineering, and STEM programs, and also looking at preschool that focuses on early childhood education. So, highly qualified teachers, these are the things we've already talked about. They made an important change to the highly qualified. They removed that the teachers in Title I had to meet highly qualified. The teachers in Title I must be certified in the state which they teach. Teachers must have a pedagogical and content knowledge verified by methods determined by their state. Special ed teachers have a bachelor's degree, full state certification. Okay. So I just wanted to give that to you for this for today's chapter, and then also know that I will be posting a review for next week's exam. So I'll post the review probably tomorrow, and it'll tell you the concepts that we're going to cover and